Hi everyone, it's me, Mr. Jackson, and welcome to today's EDU overview. And what we're going to be focusing on reviewing for today is industrialization here in the United States. Industrialization began here in the United States in the mid and towards the end of the 1800s. We are going to be off to a great start economically and industrially as new inventions change the face of America forever. Let's begin by going back to some of the causes of industrialization in America, again in the mid to the end of the 1800s. The United States, up until this point, was a predominantly agricultural society, or agrarian. That all changes when technology changes, as with anything, okay? So there are new inventions that farmers are able to utilize that benefit them greatly. Number one, they are able to farm faster because of new machines, and they are also able to farm more efficiently because they do not have to pay as many workers to take care of their crops and fields and so forth. One of these inventions was the cotton gin developed by Eli Whitney, who my son is named after. No, not really, but his name is Eli, okay? But the cotton gin revolutionized agriculture technology. It was able to separate the seed from a piece of cotton which grows on a plant and looks like a cotton ball, and what it does is it separates that seed, which was very tedious and very hard work, and now the workers did not have to do that. The machine could do it. It was like 10 men, if not more, was able to do a whole lot more efficiently. Then we have more advances with the McCormick Reaper and eventually the steam engine, which would give us tractors and plows and things like that. So with the need for less workers in the fields, those people who are working on farms are now looking for jobs. So they begin to come up north, okay? And we'll get to that later about something called the Great Migration. But as they move from the south to the north, they're coming up there to get better jobs. And there are jobs because of those increases in technology. You see, industrialization allowed industries to form. So we know that many workers are coming from the southern states typically to work in the factories in the more northern cities, okay? And the jobs are there because now these factories are there, okay? They need workers, and they need some skill, but not a ton. And these jobs in the factories pay better than the farms were, okay? Even though by our standards today it was not wealthy by any means, it certainly felt like a definite pay increase, okay? So people are getting a little bump in pay, and they're coming up here to work. Now, let's dive into what some of the effects of industrialization were, okay? So we know that the big cause of all of this that allowed industries to boom was the new increases in technology. One of those increases I failed to mention a second ago was the railroads, okay? So the railroads allow the transport of two things, products and people, okay? And when you can do both of those things, it creates a market and the ability to make money. We will have the connection of the East Coast and the West Coast of the United States with the Transcontinental Railroad. What that will allow, guys, is for the country to be united so people from the East Coast can go out to the West and vice versa, and creates new markets just as well. It's called westward expansion because we're trying to open up that gate to the West, and the railroads allow that. But some of the effects of industrialization, as with anything, there are good and bad. So let's talk about some of the good. We already mentioned how many people were able to get better paying jobs, okay? Awesome. They got an increase in pay, and they had a good, steady job. But some of the effects were negatives as well. So let's look at some of those. Number one, you see these factories weren't always the safest places to work, okay? And at this time, the United States had a policy of what was called laissez-faire, which means a free market system. They stay out of it. It's a hands-off approach to the economy, letting the economy work and just kind of staying out of it and letting it take care of itself, okay? It's a free market capitalist system that is still practiced today in some ways, but because of industrialization, there are some restrictions put in place to help workers and the market stay safe and also to be protected. So workers are working in these factories making more money, but the trade-off was because of that free market and no oversight, They were getting arms cut off, hands cut off, you name it. Okay? And what happens is their bosses don't care, the employers don't care, because they can just hire somebody else because they want the job. Okay? So there was no safety oversight. We also have the introduction of child labor. Now, it was no new thing that kids worked, okay? And that wasn't an issue really when they worked on farms, because it's very common for kids to work on farms, but in the factories, the kids were often hired because they had tiny hands, smaller bodies. They could get to places and do some very tedious work that a grown person could not do. But as we've already established, it was very, very unsafe. Okay, so child labor became a huge, huge issue of industrialization in America. And as I've mentioned before, another effect, both good and bad, was that as people began to move to these large cities, okay, the populations began to grow in these cities, and we call that effect urbanization, which simply means the growth of, you guessed it, cities, okay? So what happens next is these cities become overcrowded very quickly. People are literally living on top of each other, and we call that tenement housing. And we got multiple families living together. You know, can you imagine living with your parents, grandparents, your brothers, sisters, your aunts, uncles, great-grandparents, and maybe some neighbors? You know, it's crazy, absolutely crazy. But here's the reason. The cost of real estate in these large cities was very expensive, okay? So what that allowed were two effects. One was it changed the urban landscape in America forever for what we see today with skyscrapers, because the land was more expensive. And so the companies and employers and businesses did not want to build out because they didn't want to buy the land, so they built up, okay? It also allowed something called the suburbs, okay, which is a smaller city outside of a larger city. And as people who could afford it had a little extra cash, okay, they were able to move outside of these large areas to get away from the crowded cities. Think of it as like Vandalia. It's a suburb of the city of Dayton. Dayton's the largest, closest city. We have several smaller cities just outside of it, okay? Vandalia, Brookville, West Milton, New Lebanon, okay? Centerville, all of those surrounding areas are suburbs, okay? So industrialization certainly had pros and cons, but it also had one more effect, okay? And that effect was the creation of unions. You see, we talked about some of those negative effects, such as working conditions and child labor. Another problem was that these new employees, although they were making more money than they were on farms, they were being forced to work longer hours in these unsafe conditions and not being compensated for that. A union formed to help protect workers' rights or to gain rights of equality, fairness, and safety. The American Federation of Labor will be one of the largest. However, at the beginning of their rise, if you will, unions are going to have very negative connotations because they're going to become associated with violence. On the Great Railroad Strike, the Homestead Strike, and the Pullman Strike, there's violence often involved. In fact, in a couple of those situations, the United States Army is forced to come in to calm things down because it gets so out of hand. All right? Later on, that stigma will kind of go away, and unions are able to make some great progress with the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor more so, and get some safety reforms in place, okay? So the unions will fight for safer working conditions, and they will eventually be able to end child labor and under some other progressive reforms. But early on, they'll have a lot of trouble because they'll become associated with some negative things like violence that resulted at some protest. That's today's EDU overview, and we've been talking about industrialization and its positives and negatives and some causes and effects of it. Hopefully it helps you. You guys rock, and I'll see you soon.